Someone recently asked me if I could talk about the phenomenon of isolation, this new normal that in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic we are all experiencing. And what was kind of ironically amusing, I guess, to me was that uh, this request came at a time when I was set to go camping alone. uh, and not only was it camping alone, but camping alone in a wilderness area where there were no other amenities. No pump for the water, no outhouse, no bathroom. Pretty rustic kind of situation. And interestingly, as I was at my campsite and considering this question of isolation and indeed the suffering that it has caused people, the contradiction between that experience and my own as a camper was conspicuous. I mean, the entire time that I was camping, I did not feel alone. I certainly didn't feel um, isolated in any negative kind of sense. Um, but I also certainly recognize that other kinds of isolation, kinds that we haven't volunteered for, can be the wellspring for a good deal of suffering, feelings of being cut off, feelings of loneliness. So I was wondering about what this difference is between the unpleasant side of isolation brought about by social distancing and stay-at-home orders and the kind of isolation that I had deliberately sought out for myself. It began to be the lens through which I was seeing things and hearing things all around me while I was in the woods. So, what really constitutes a healthy relationship between an individual and society? When I was in the woods, everything seemed to become a metaphor for this question. Now, the place where I was camping, it's the Nordhaus Dunes Wilderness area. It's right along the shore of Lake Michigan, and so even right there is a perfect metaphor where you have the waves on the lake as if they were individuals, each wave completely unique, not altogether unlike other waves, but unique in their own ways. And the lake as a whole, a collection of waves. And if you were to impose some kind of isolation on individual waves, well, they would cease to be waves as we generally know them. They would be something else. The lake itself, deprived of its waves, would not be the lake we know. So that kind of peculiar picture is exactly what we seem to be living during the course of this pandemic. In nature, you can look around, there's fewer distractions, and you can see emerging processes of individuation and also processes of merging, unity. So this experience of isolation is one we really have to ask ourselves about and wonder how can we work with this as Buddhists. Well, I think first of all we have to recognize the nature of the problem. That's just a practical suggestion, because we humans, we are social creatures. We are genetically wired for company. being with other people. And so, when an individual experiences an unwanted separation from others, loneliness arises, and so does a lot of other mental and physical health effects, as well documented by the psychological and medical communities. But from my perspective as a Zen teacher, what I think is probably central for our consideration is that isolation, when it's been imposed upon us, causes suffering because it limits or removes our opportunities to affirm our existence with others of our kind. At the most fundamental level, physical contact, just physical contact, to be touched, affirms our existence. Zoom, as wonderful as it is, can't help us do that. You can't hug someone via Skype. This is one of those cases where you can't say there's an app for that. So when we're extremely isolated, therefore, it feels as if it's possible we don't exist, or maybe that we just don't need to exist, or possibly that our existence is not worth anyone else's time and interest. And the consequences can be very severe. Obviously, depression is one of those consequences, mental breakdown, and in some cases, even suicide. Now, we're not the first people in history to experience this kind of thing. I was reading the other day about pioneers in the American West and also Western Canada. People in the United States had rushed out onto the Great Plains to stake out claims when the government told them that they could have land for free. All they had to do was stake it out and take care of it. Of course, this ignores the fact that the land belonged to Native Americans. But there was this land rush, and people went out and they staked their 640-acre claims and then became, in essence, prisoners upon them, and suffered immensely sometimes with something that came to be known in the 19th century as prairie fever or prairie madness. Well, prairie madness is not a medical diagnosis, but it's something that was very widely documented at the time. And there are also fictional accounts of prairie madness or prairie fever. And it was characterized by very strange behavior. It happened when your nearest neighbor is a mile away, and you can't just get there. You can't just drop everything in your subsistence existence in order to go visit the neighbors who might not even be home when you get there anyway. And in the winter on the northern plains, it would have been an even greater problem. You just wouldn't be able to get out. So people were isolated, very much so at that time, and would become acutely depressed. Men, as men do, tended toward more violent kinds of behaviors. Women also were demonstrative of their feelings. It's reported, who knows what the actuality was, but it's reported that women particularly committed suicide because of their abject feelings of extreme isolation. So we can't just pretend that isolation is not a significant human health issue. And when that kind of extreme isolation is enforced upon people against their will or as a form of punishment, I personally consider that torture. I briefly worked in a maximum security prison at one point, and I know prisoners, the inmates, were very afraid of being put into solitary confinement. It's a completely horrible form of punishment. And they, quote unquote, go crazy. It's pretty awful. So this isolation that we're experiencing now brings up lots of questions like this. How best can we practice if we can't meet for zazen? How can we appreciate this life right in the midst of our isolation? Indeed, how might we appreciate isolation itself? And that's something I want to address here. Well, here, a form of mindfulness practice can be very helpful, I think. And it's helpful not just for feelings of being isolated, but any other kind of unpleasant feeling. In mindfulness practice, of course, we keep the mind at a level of bare attention and simply observe our circumstances. And we do that without judgment or analysis or evaluation of any kind. Just simply and neutrally observe what's going on without us and within us. And you can try this right now. I mean, just close your eyes. Take a clearing breath. And give yourself over entirely to the feeling of isolation. Or if it's loneliness that you feel, give yourself entirely over to the feeling of loneliness. For some people, isolation produces confusion or anger, but again, the technique is the same. Give yourself over entirely to just observing how a particular unpleasant feeling exists within you. Now, you may notice that if you are really open, like right now, you're really open to your feeling of, let's say, loneliness, that it almost immediately begins to slip through your fingers, dissipating entirely. Really try to observe where this feeling is housed within your mind body, and it vanishes. And I think you'll find in its place an open and neutral, unmarked space. And what this practice can do for us is help us realize that the power of our emotions over our lives is not based on some innate quality in our emotions, but rather on our having identified with those emotions. And we do this so quickly, so rapidly. We have this idea that the feeling that is predominant is the only feeling we have and is who we are. We identify with it, sometimes kind of unconsciously. And there's a famous exchange between the sixth Zen ancestor Bodhidharma and his successor Hui Ke. This is recorded in case 41 of the Mumankana, the Gateless Gate collection of koans. And in this koan, Hui Ke is he wants to get Bodhidharma's attention. He wants to be Bodhidharma's student, and he is really at a point of kind of extraordinary desperation. His mind is very agitated. He can't attain any kind of peace of mind. He can't penetrate into the source of his real problem, or can't see what the obstacle is. And Bodhidharma, as you may know, was famous for having gone to China, and after an encounter with an emperor, kind of just retired to a cave and reportedly sat zazen for 9 years, facing the wall of the cave. And so Hui Ke is outside the cave, and he wants to get this teacher's attention. And he waits and he waits. He even waits through a blizzard on his knees, meditating on his knees in the snow, waiting to be noticed. And finally, he can't take it anymore. And as is reflected in the koan, he goes to Bodhidharma, who has been ignoring him pretty steadfastly, and says, Bodhidharma, my mind has no peace. Can't get peace of mind no matter how hard I try. I beg you, Master, please pacify my mind. And Bodhidharma replies, bring your mind here, and I will pacify it for you. And Weikuo says, I have searched everywhere for my mind, and I can't take hold of it. I can't find it anywhere. Now he's looked and looked for the mind to see, if he could find where it is, then he could pacify it. He could have peace of mind, reach tranquility. So he says, I've searched for my mind and I cannot take hold of it. And Bodhidharma says, now your mind is pacified. You see, Weikuo was really completely identified with his own agitated mind, identified really with his own suffering, and making a distinction, thinking about things dualistically, making a distinction between his agitation and his notions about enlightened existence. He couldn't see that the very thing he wanted to pacify was his teacher, his own mind. So identifying with our feelings of loneliness or isolation is a choice we don't necessarily really have to make. In the realm of creative potential, or let's say the subtle source of all forms of reality, we are free to make other choices, any choice. So what if, instead of looking at isolation and loneliness as problems or as simply the source of our suffering, we looked at them as teachers of the way? You see, in the very instant that we think of something like isolation as our teacher, we shift our perspective. Suddenly, isolation is something more like solitude. So both isolation and solitude convey a sense of separation of the individual from everything else. But solitude is generally considered kind of a good thing. And we need solitude to develop in our practice. In fact, every spiritual tradition includes some form of solitude as a prerequisite for spiritual development. In Zen, we have sesshin, our retreats. Typically, they're supposed to be a week long. Sesshin, gathering of mind. How do we gather mind? We find solitude. How we find it together. So it's a community of people seeking solitude. But this is based on the Buddha's solitude. Take his case as a model, if you will. When he had studied meditation with some masters, this is after he left home and became a monk, he went to the woods, like I did. He went to the woods and practiced meditation and other austerities with just a few friends, okay? But eventually he decided that the austerities were not helping. Meditation was good, but torturing your body with the idea that you're going to somehow release your soul only led to increased pain. And so he left, and he entered into another level of solitude or isolation. He was by himself under the bo tree when he attained nirvana. So solitude is a wonderful thing. Well, you could also look at our current situation through the lens of other words, if that helps shift your perspective and helps you bring about a little more flexibility for practice. Well, what if, for example, we, instead of the word isolation, we used the word seclusion? The Vipassana tradition uses the word seclusion in a positive sense, just like we might use the word solitude, to describe effort, the effort to enter into and sustain samadhi, or single pointed concentration, which we need for effective meditation. So one secludes the mind from, according to tradition, 5 hindrances to the development of samadhi, sometimes called 5 poisons. And these 5 poisons are sensual desires, ill will, torpor, or sloth, agitation, or restlessness, and doubt. And when these things are operating, they really stop us from turning our light inward and discovering who we really are. Like right now, for example, the governor's stay-at-home and social distancing orders conflict with your your sensual desire to have a Dairy Queen ice cream cone. You're going to suffer because you can't gratify your senses. We have to be clear that pointing the finger of blame at the governor, or at the governor's order, or even more absurdly at a virus called COVID-19, we're just completely missing the cause of our suffering. And if we don't recognize what the cause of our suffering is, we will not end suffering. So we have to recognize it for what it is. You're suffering because you're attached to your sensual desires, in this case for ice cream. It could be many other things. So we absolutely must seclude the mind from the 5 hindrances at the outset of our practice, or we won't be able to develop our power of concentration. And without that, we will not be able to realize the true self. Now, as I was preparing this talk, I was actually thinking a little bit more about loneliness than isolation. Loneliness does arise as a consequence of isolation, almost guaranteed. That feeling is guaranteed to arise. And what I did not know until recently was that loneliness is a word that really was not used very much prior to the Industrial Revolution. It has become increasingly used since the Industrial Revolution, which tells you quite a bit about the state of Western industrialized cultures. Now, loneliness in the 21st century, at least in the Western world, is a pandemic in its own right. We didn't need COVID-19 to have a problem with loneliness. It pre-existed COVID-19 as a problem. In fact, some more progressive governments, recognizing this problem, created governmental authorities or partnerships to address the issue because it's such a big social issue. In fact, in England, they created a new ministerial position, and it is literally known as the Minister of Loneliness. So they're taking it very seriously. What I also learned in exploring loneliness is that there was another term used much more often before the Industrial Revolution, and almost never now. I don't think anybody uses it now, but I think we might return to it and derive some benefit from it. And that word is exactly the same as loneliness, except for one letter, the letter L. The word that was in use was oneliness. Isn't that wonderful? Oneliness. It's the perfect word, in my opinion, to describe what sesshin is like, or what our individual home practice is like. Oneliness is at heart what we Buddhists might refer to as seclusion. Now, in earlier times, a couple centuries ago, oneliness meant like a mixture of physical solitude, but also a kind of focused, contemplative state of mind. So oneliness, unlike loneliness, was a desirable thing and necessary for contemplation of God. And this is why I say oneliness is a great term for what we do in Zen. So, interesting word. Of course, our practice isn't about just swapping a pleasanter word for an unpleasant one. It's not just a matter of vocabulary, or the idea that by switching things up a little bit, we might cure ourselves of the feelings we find unpleasant. That's not it. Really, I'm just trying to present some opening possibilities for shifting our perspective a little bit and being creative. So, if we were to practice oneliness, we do so not because we want to avoid loneliness, but precisely because we want to know ourselves. And we want to know ourselves as lonely people, or as isolated people, if that is the reality that we're living. Now, this is not so easy to do, because as soon as you try to summon up the feeling of loneliness, you can't do it. You'll fail. It vanishes. Just like Hui Ke's agitated state of mind. Or just his mind. It just disappeared every time he tried to grasp after it. You can't seek the mind with the mind. When you really look into this, you discover pretty quickly that the only way you ever really can be conscious of your emotional landscape is by recalling it. When, here, and now, in the current moment, you're just trying to summon up the feeling, it's not going to happen. It's not there. But that openness is. And it is why I guess I like to go camping. And I recommend going out into nature during this time as a practice to help us when we are suffering from our isolation. Now, I teach literature at a community college, and so it's kind of natural for me to think of literary precursors, and what came to mind was Henry David Thoreau, who went to live in a shack by Walden Pond for a couple of years. And he explained why he did that. He explained it in a single sentence, and it's the most famous sentence he ever wrote. He wrote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." I love that phrase, to front only the essential facts of life, to let go of everything except what you need right here, right now. You know, when you're camping alone, everything that you need, everything that you want, requires you to consider those essential facts of life. You want to eat, you have to cook. You want to cook, you have to make a fire. You want to make a fire, you have to gather and cut wood. So when you are camping, let's say when you are, as Thoreau put it, out in the woods, you're out of remove from the social distractions that prevent us from seeing things clearly. I mean, I'm telling you, this is why the Buddha and his followers did not live within cities. They lived outside of cities. They were isolated on purpose, self-isolating. Because when you are out there, human pretenses are stripped away. You think about your life wherever you are living. You're constantly surrounded by televisions and computers and cars and cell phones and advertising and talking, and it's like being marinated in a message that begs us to hang on, to cling, to affirm the ego. But in the woods, you just look around. Do you see trees hanging on? Birds hanging on? And that's what I did camping. I just observed not hanging on. It was all around me. And while I was out, I like to watch birds, and there was a bird around my camp, and it sang all day, loudly, all day around my camp. And it was just one bird. There weren't others of its kind. Only one bird sang from the top of one or another tree around my camp. And it did that all day, every day. It was kind of a beautiful, if perhaps a little lonely, kind of call. And some of the mystery of the sound it made, I suppose, was brought about by the fact that I could never see it. It perched only in the tops of very tall trees, and I just couldn't see it through the foliage. And hour after hour, it would call and wait. There was a pause. And then there was another call. And another pause. There was always a call and then a pause, as if the bird were trying to communicate and waiting for a response, which never came. It called so many times and waited for a response so many times that I just could not help but kind of project my human feelings onto this bird, and my heart just ached for it. And I started to wonder if birds can feel anything akin to human loneliness. I wondered, in fact, if it were saying, I am here. Are you? Scientists estimate that there are 3 billion fewer birds in North America today than there were in 1970. So, in fact, who knows? This could have been the last bird of its kind. Well, we humans, I think almost everybody has entertained the idea at one time or another of being the last person on Earth and what that would be like. And I suppose there's kind of this initial giddy feeling that you'd be completely free, you'd be able to do anything, and nobody would come after you or shame you, or no reason for you to feel bad about anything because there's no one else. But if you stick with that fantasy a bit, you realize, you know, maybe you don't really know how you'd behave. Maybe you'd go nuts and have a full blown case of prairie madness and shoot up an empty town. Or maybe you'd spiral down into a deep depression and hang yourself in the garage. Or maybe you'd drive to work every day and try to do your job even though there is no job anymore and no one to do it for. Sometimes thinking about something like that can make us feel sad. But here's what I want to say about it. What if that's how it is, really, all the time? What if that's how it has always been? For all of us, with or without a pandemic. You see, I think it may not be such a bad thing to be the last of one's kind, to practice as though one is the last of one's kind, because when you do that, you discover a subtle form of peace deep down below that most absolute form of aloneness or oneliness. What you discover is this singularity, that you are absolutely alone, not because you're socially isolated, not just because you're staying home, not because of some abject existentialist philosophy, but because of a real, true, and deep realization of your oneliness. I would say to go to this place is to enter the Emerald Palace. It's in that palace that the Buddha declared, in heaven and on earth, I alone am the world honored one. Now, only those who are willing to wade into the deep water of their own oneliness can know of this realm. The Buddha wasn't bragging at all. He was describing the pristine emerald palace of reality, a palace that extends infinitely in all directions, including everything, including you, including me, everything, excluding nothing at all. This is far beyond some kind of thought of spiritual connectedness. It's not even a kind of spiritual interconnectedness. Because if there's a connection here somewhere, then there is some kind of separation. There is some kind of duality at work in the mind. See, there has to be at least two of something before a connection can exist. No, we're not talking about connectedness in any way. We're talking about a supreme isolation, a realm in which isolation and intimacy merge. I don't know what will become of us during this pandemic. I might die. You might die. Maybe nothing will happen. I don't doubt that there will be psychological and physical injuries as a result of having to separate ourselves from each other. I don't know what will happen. All I can tell you is what a little bird told me. I am here. Are you?